month-long vacation from capitalism. It's a chance to eat red food, wear red accessories. If you happen to break your wrist, you could get a nice red cast like I did. Or you could read Red Lit, little Karl Marx, Grundrisse maybe, or in this case, Hope Against Hope from Out of the Woods. Before we get into today's program, which, as I said, is Hope Against Hope with Out of the Woods and Elizabeth Battistoni, I want to give you a heads up for some of the things that are coming right down the pipe from Red May. In fact, later today at 5 p.m., we have a panel called System Crash, What Next? With Jody Dean, Leo Panich, Assad Haider, and Doug Henwood as the moderator. Tomorrow night at 6 p.m., what was liberalism? What was liberalism? Well, we'll find out tomorrow night from Alexander Zevin, Aziz Rana, Catherine Chaput, Michael Bray is the moderator, and I will be contributing to that one. And then on Saturday afternoon at 12 p.m., another of our panels that ranges around the world from Italy to England to the United States to Canada, bottlenecks, choke points, and supply chains with Lale Khalili, Charmaine Chua, Sandro Mazadra, Deborah Cowan, and Spencer Cox. Dara Orenstein, unfortunately, won't be able to make it, but it should be a great panel on logistics. So a lot of good stuff coming down the pipe. And, you know, if you want to know all the things, subscribe to Red May TV on YouTube. You can also watch some of the ones you missed. And more important, you'll see a little link down there, which will take you to the donate site, because we do need money to keep this going and to go live again next year. You'll also find on our website, www.redmayseattle.org, a place to donate. We depend on the kindness of strangers. We're at, I think, $2,675. Let's see if we can get up to $3,000 a day. Go to the website, click donate, look into your heart and into your pockets. But now I want to turn it over to our moderator today, political theorist, Alyssa Battistoni, who's the co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. Take it away, Alyssa.
Awesome. Thank you, Philip. And thank you to the rest of the Red May crew. This is such a great event, and especially welcome this year when we all need as much sort of, you know, virtual comradeship and entertainment as we can get and learning. But I'm really pleased today to be moderating this event for the first collection of writing, Hope Against Hope. From a collective I've learned a lot from over the years, both as a collective and from individual members writing, and that's Out of the Woods. Out of the Woods is a transnational political research and theory collective, a loose grouping of decolonial small c communist, anti-racist, queer feminist thinkers working together to think through the problem of ecological crisis. And today we're joined by three members of the collective, Sophie, Dave, and Kai, who will each now introduce themselves and the collective.
Thanks, Alyssa. My name is Kai. I'm going to start off with a little intro and then pass it over to Sophie, who will be followed by Dave, and then a little bit more for myself. So we live in the midst of ecological crisis. Many of us know this at some level, though the extent, breadth, depth, history, and complexity of this crisis make its comprehension as a totality beyond any of us individually. And though we know and feel that it's going on, climate change is still all too often a tagline at the end of left analyses advocating for liberation or equality, where it is often understood to be new, novel, or perhaps something that will only come in a distant future. Such a move, we think, indicates what must be a willful forgetting of 500 years of intertwined, yet not coincident, disasters of racial capitalism, of colonialism and imperialism, of settler colonialism, slavery and its afterlives, heteropatriarchy, and border imperialism. To simply say that we live in the midst of ecological crisis, as I just did, would fail to disclose that the we in the midst of this crisis is in no way coherent. Disaster itself is not simply an event, but a condition distributed unevenly across space and time. Riffing on Ruth Wilson Gilmore, then, we insist on the importance of understanding ecological crisis as incorporating and being reproduced by the state-sanctioned and legal reproduction and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death. If this is the case, then it becomes clear that ecological crisis is something that is only unevenly being taken as a condition for thinking communism or revolution today. And if this is true, then we really require some different political ontologies, epistemologies, and strategies than those that are currently dominant among many socialists and communists in the heart of empire. What world do we orient ourselves to? Through what concepts, frames, and tools do we understand it? And how best do we leverage the collective power of human and non-human comrades, kin, and kith for transformation? These are some of the questions that Out of the Woods takes up and which we'd like to explore today, but honestly, we don't come with any kind of plan, program, or line that's totally coherent. As a collective, we really muddle our way through and around these questions in hopes of developing some better or different ways of orienting towards a communist present and future. And so what we want to do virtually today is really invite you all to muddle around with us a bit and see what we can come up with together. Okay, send it to Sophie.
Hi, yeah, I'm just going to say a little bit about who Out of the Woods or what Out of the Woods is or are. Alyssa just mentioned we're a loose grouping of currently about 8 sort of small c communists in the UK and the USA, sort of reading and writing about ecology, or if you like, a transnational anti-racist queer feminist research collective doing anti-capitalist ecological commentary and theory. And we began around 6 years ago in 2014 via an online conversation in the UK concerning the relationship between capitalism and climate change. To date, the Out of the Woods sort of modus operandi, which is completely ad hoc, has involved sort of studying together, chatting and occasionally meeting online, summarizing the writings of key thinkers for one another, debating them, and sometimes reading scientific reports. As I understand it, the impetus behind the project for the founding members of Out of the Woods was a certain kind of feeling of exhaustion about the dominant strands of ecological politics in the global north, the sense of a sort of endless oscillation between a supposedly pragmatic kind of greenwashing of capitalism on the one hand, or a greening of capitalism on the one hand, and a return to a sort of romantic naturalism with reactionary tendencies on the other. Since that time, a lot of new people have joined, and another, half dozen have also moved on to other things, but the object of analysis has more or less stayed the same, although it's also shifted, and we have also shifted in our opinions and our takes. Our activity sort of ebbs and flows, but it kind of works pleasurably. We sometimes feel like we're somehow bringing each of us something unique and useful in terms of our capabilities into the mess of our collective writing process. We sort of complement one another, regardless of whether it's 2 of us or 7 of us working on a text. Some of us are anonymous and others aren't. We disagree on stuff. We are not a very diverse group, and the question of group composition or recomposition is kind of one of our main meeting agenda points at the moment, particularly now that the book, which I think, yeah, I think I'm the only one in the actual collective who has a physical version of it, is done and published. We have no desire to stay white and mostly male. We are also not a magazine, brand, organization, or even a platform. Presently, some of us are non-academics and some of us are adjuncts or graduate students. Some are sort of lay nerds, semi-lapsed climate justice activists doing full-time parenting, but comfortable reading hard scientific papers in some cases. Others have backgrounds in human geography or literary and utopian studies, and are, you know, in my case, almost entirely innumerate. Our points in common seem to be a sort of expansive abolitionist cyborg understanding of what ecology is or might be, and a desire to understand how exploitation, domination, privatization, and exhaustion are at the core of the climate crisis. But not only to understand, also a desire to abolish the present state of things, and an unapologetically utopian wish to actualize communism through liberation struggles emerging from the global proletariat. And we're especially interested in amplifying the ways in which Black, Indigenous, queer, and migrant thinkers and movements around the world have been at the forefront of that transformative struggle. So a struggle we understand as sort of within, against, and beyond the ecological crisis, which is a crisis precipitated by the nexus of capitalism, raciality, and coloniality. The book pretty much brings together all of the things we've ever published, with some exceptions, a few. And so, you know, these are for you to ask us about. We've done critiques of accelerationist thought in the form of reviews and essays about Inventing the Future by Alex Williams and Nick Shunicek. We've done stuff on the political economy of hunger, and what we call cyborg agroecology. We've done work on refugees and death worlds, on border imperialism. We've done work on Murray Bookchin and James O'Connor and eco-Marxisms and the second contradiction and so on. We've done work on the folkish environmentalism of Paul Kingsnorth and the Dark Mountain Project, because one of our main concerns ongoingly is the presence of eco-fascism within liberal environmentalism. And we've done work on Naomi Klein, as well as on Jason W. Moore, the author of Capitalism and the Web of Life. We have done work on climate populism and on reproductive futurism. This was something that, as a collective, we have differed a little bit on and moved some distance from our initial already critical but still sort of enthusiastic treatment of Lee Edelman, the author of this you know, canonical sort of work of queer theory, who talks about the fascism of the baby's face. We have sort of been deeply trying, and this is why, as some of you may know, I'm also someone who writes about family abolition. There's a family abolition panel next week as part of Red May. Part of what we are interested in, and part of what I do in Out of the Woods, as well as out of the Woods. My God, is it time for my, no, I was telling the moderators that I'm desperately trying to avoid a joke about wishing that the woods would get out of me, because I'm suffering from hay fever extremely acutely at the moment. But we see our modus operandi is a sort of cutting across various binaries, such as the putative binary between eco-modernism and a sort of more deep green kind of brand of ecology, at cutting across binaries like nature and culture, and the regenerative and the reproductive. We, you know, in that sense, I have been, you know, pretty keen to put that heuristic, which I see as the cyborg heuristic proposed by Donna Haraway in the 80s, at the heart of our analysis. And therefore, there is a sort of definition of the ecological for us that has that it is difficult, in fact, to put a boundary around. The instrumentalization of the figure of the child within the political is a sort of crucial component of our critique. So the question of how we do kinship, how we do care, and how we do the family is not some sort of separate issue of reproductive politics that doesn't really have a place within an ecological writing collective's sort of analysis and study. Rather, we see these things as extremely key and central to the work that we wish for, that might be able to militate against the detached and ambient politics of crisis, fear, and apocalypse, endemic to fascism, and towards instead fostering ever increasing moments of abolitionist care. And I'm going to hand over to Dave.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, great work, Sophie. Thank you. So thanks to Handmaid for having us. So I'm going to talk a little bit about disaster communism, which is probably an idea for which it's quite well known. It's probably our most well-known idea or phrase, and it kind of travels as a phrase and takes on a life of its own. It's not a phrase that we coined ourselves. The first 3 Out of the Woods blogs on Libcom explored this idea, but they took the name from a blog by Nick Southall on Revolts Now. And Nick actually has continued to write about disaster communism and expresses some disagreement with us. We have debated the term quite a lot internally in the collective recently about its valence, its utility, whether we still want to use it, and perhaps some of the dangers. And the fact that I'm going to open this by talking about what disaster communism as we understand it is perhaps evidence of some of the dangers that the term carries with it. So for us, disaster communism is absolutely not a preference for disaster. We do not believe that tsunamis arrive with hammers and sickles on them, that the worse conditions get, the better things are for communists. So it's absolutely not a preference for disaster. Other people have used it that way, usually critically, to say, I'm not a disaster communist, I don't want disaster. So I think that's something that's really important for us to spell out. And it's perhaps why we didn't consider calling the book Disaster Communism for very long. It was a possible title, but we decided to move away from it. And we'll talk about the title that we have used a little later on. So having said what disaster communism isn't, or at least what it isn't for us, I'll try and explain a little bit more about what we mean by the term. So it draws heavily on Rebecca Solnit's concept of the disaster community, both in our early writing and our ongoing writing on the concept, and in Nick Southall's work as well. And for Solnit, when disasters happen, and she's drawing on a long line here of sociological research, including quite mainstream sociological research, sociologists employed by the US military, for example. She argues that when disasters strike, people don't behave as might be expected. So we don't have this Hobbesian war of all against all, but rather relationships of mutuality, solidarity, and care. She draws quite heavily on accounts of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. But we can point to all kinds of disasters across the world in different situations, both what are normally called natural disasters and disasters, things like the Hillsborough football disaster in the UK, where people were crushed because of poor crowd control, but people supported each other, risked their own well-being, and really looked out for each other. So Solnit really celebrates these communities and sort of invests them with a hope that things could be better. But the communities remain limited to disaster as a time-limited event. So when a disaster happens, these communities emerge. And then I think the question really, and this question is begged again by a recent beautifully written piece by Solnit in The Guardian around COVID-19, the question is begged, okay, where does this go? Where do we take this hope? Where do we take these relationships of mutuality once that disaster has stopped? So what we argue is that disaster is not simply an event. that there are, of course, disastrous events, but that these are produced by and reproduce disastrous conditions. The drought, the flood happens because of a much broader ecological crisis. So disastrous events intensify disastrous conditions, and these disastrous conditions are unevenly distributed, unevenly felt along lines of coloniality, disability, race, gender, class, sexuality. So the disastrous event intensifies these conditions. So if we think that the disaster community is perhaps a response to these disastrous events, then disaster communism is both a kind of empirical observation of what happens in these communities, but a proposal for what might happen on a broader scale. So it's about extrapolating from the disaster community to take the struggle to the disaster that is capitalism at the level of totality. So it's both an empirical observation. There's this kind of what we've called a baseline communism that exists in relationships of mutuality, of care, of looting, of taking what you need and giving what you can. But there's also this amplification of that to position it against capitalism. So the kind of positive concept of positive content of communism is from each according to their ability to each according to their need, but also the negating power of communism as the abolition of things as they exist. So that's a kind of broad introductory sweep. We've most recently laid out a kind of take on disaster communism in the chapter that concludes our book. But what I want to pose, we were asked in a little interview we did for Common Notions, we were asked to sort of say how disaster communism differs from other approaches to ecological crisis. And we found it quite a hard question to answer. It does differ, of course, we think. But perhaps the more interesting question, or the question that we want to think through, is how it relates. What does a disaster communist do? Clearly it's pitched against the state. We believe that the state intensifies these disasters, is complicit in disaster capitalism, and uses these disasters as opportunities to perpetuate exclusions and relations of oppression. You just have to look at the state's response to COVID-19, sending in people to break up homeless camps, to Hurricane Katrina, sending in the military, to police shooting looters, etc. But how would, as disaster communists, how might we relate to left approaches that look to take over the state, to calls for a Green New Deal, to what Jeff Mann and Joel Wainwright have referred to as climate Maoism, the attempt to use the power of the state in a kind of more top-down communist manner. And these are questions I think we perhaps don't have any answers to, but I think they're quite pressing. So I'm thinking about work like Alyssa's book, We Have a Planet to Win. Clearly, as disaster communists, we would be skeptical of many of the things that a state might do, many of the ways that a state might seek to even seek to do good around the climate, and that the introduction of green technology could perpetuate colonial relations of extraction, could perpetuate the use of prison labor. So for us, I think a key and pressing question is, what might disaster communists do if there is a kind of socialist or social democratic government that operates, or a series of governments across the globe? How do we stand in solidarity with indigenous peoples, with child laborers, with the colonized peoples, whose exploitation may be furthered and continued by a socialist Green New Deal? And I think that's where I'm going to leave this. But that's a huge question for us, I think, at the moment. I'm going to hand over to Kai, who's going to talk a little bit more about some of the other emerging forces around climate change at the moment. And then we'll conclude by talking about the title of the book a little. Thanks.
Okay. Hopefully you can hear me. So what I want to talk about next, which really builds off the comments that Sophie and Dave just made, is just thinking about how ecological crisis is not something, or an ecological movement is not something that is automatically progressive or socialist, but is very much a battleground or a field of tense relationships among different political orientations. orientations, which include the left, socialists, communists, and anarchists, of course, but also liberals, neoliberals, and the right, the political right. And so it's certainly become increasingly recognized on the Green left that there is either a reactionary appropriation of environmentalist themes or a reactionary side or angle to interpreting ecological crisis. Oftentimes and increasingly, this has gone under the name of ecofascism, which is understood to be one of perhaps several different sorts of right-wing analyses of ecological degradation that attempts to locate it's the source of this crisis in globalism, in migration, or population growth. In response to this, it prescribes racial or ethnic cleansing of some kind as its purportedly ecological solution. I think it's difficult to understate how obscene this political project is and how forcefully we must reject this reactionary tendency whenever it appears. And much like green, purportedly green capitalism, ecofascism can only ever be an ideology that fails to resolve the material contradictions of the ecological crisis, because it will forever be unable to understand that the crisis stems from the racial, national, imperial, and colonial systems that it takes to be natural and in need of reinstating. Now, however, denunciations of ecofascism have become rather easy and quick, I think. For example, the ridiculous claim that nature is returning in the midst of the COVID economic slowdown, to which sometimes it supposedly would follow that humans are the virus, right? And of course, the virus is serving as an overarching metaphor for anything and everything these days. And we've seen happily or encouragingly that pushing back against these claims has entailed a much more interesting and complicated analyses in which any purported benign effect of the economic slowdown due to the planetary COVID situation is only an aspect of ecological crisis more generally, and reveals an egregious and uneven sacrifice that inheres in the altar of economic growth, a kind of death drive that seems to propel capitalism. And we see people kind of, sometimes enthusiastically celebrating this. And so we need alternative explanations, and I'm happy that a lot of these exist. But the risk of these kind of uncritical and banal assertions that humans are the virus is a kind of conditioning of a social class that's ready to accept and perhaps even participate in a broader and more widespread planetary depopulation. And rarely have the political consequences of such a program have been announced by their promoters as clearly as Garrett Hardin did in his 1970 essay, Lifeboat Ethics, the Case Against Helping the Poor. And in one of the sections of our book, we show how and why Hardin took this kind of a situation of ecological and food crisis as ethically requiring, ethically in gigantic scare quotes, ethically requiring immigration restriction and mass death in the name of what would be white survival. Hardin himself had material and ideological connections to the anti-immigrant movement in North America, and some of those connections have continued to propel these ideas through the Trump administration to this day. So this kind of a situation would be expected if we take, oh, excuse me, sorry. So, on the other hand, however, such orientations around, dismissing humans are the virus as fascism can be a part of various liberalisms and capitalist governance strategies, which, in their ideologies explicitly position themselves against fascism while still upholding a kind of death drive that continues on and on, churning in the background. And finally, we can also find these kinds of injunctions towards a kind of common sense depopulation, either surreptitiously or explicitly in significant parts of white environmentalism as is practiced in North America and Europe. So the extent of the problem is a little bit more, a little bit wider and more diffuse than maybe one would like it to be. Now, this, I guess, should be expected if we take fascism as definitionally about the consolidation of authoritarian power through a kind of popular project, popular ethno-nationalist project, which is ineluctably historically built through the mutual imbrication of racial capitalism and global colonial and settler colonial empires, as numerous thinkers from Amy Césaire to Cedric Robinson to Denise Ferreira da Silva have analyzed in different ways, in complementary ways. So discussions of ecofascism oftentimes get caught up in thinking there's some threshold one crosses, at which point you can point at someone and be like, that's a fascist. And we're kind of concerned about that and tend to instead use terms like reactionary, proto-fascist, or folkish to describe some of the tendencies we see emerging in environmentalism. We really try to think about the existing world structure of capitalist and colonial crisis that precipitates, encourages, and rewards the formation of reactionary individuals and movements, many of them interior to not only moments of crisis, but interior to the moral economies of everyday racial capitalism. And thus any environmentalism and, I'm afraid to say also any socialism or communism that wouldn't acknowledge the latter runs these risks as well. So let me give a couple of examples as grist for talking about what we mean by like a kind of ambient or circulating far-right ecology. So in 2017, I attended a public lecture by the science writer Elizabeth Kolbert concerning her essay collection, The Sixth Extinction, which had recently come out. And this talk was in Minneapolis. There were several hundred present. The book was, of course, a huge hit. It kind of documents the melancholy that scientists especially feel in witnessing the extinction of many different kinds of non-human species and their attempts to try to save them in some way or another. It's not a political book explicitly, and so in the Q&A after this talk, which was just basically like a book summary, the audience, the questions immediately jump to this question of what is to be done, because the book refuses to grapple with that. And so you get your standard liberal responses. It's after the election of Trump, so people are like, why don't people listen to science? Maybe we should conserve more. Why can't we have renewable energy? All of this stuff. And after about 15 minutes, finally the question arrives on someone who's standing near me, and they get up and a little bit sheepishly say, well, we're really not talking about the elephant in the room here. It's clear from your book that overpopulation is a huge problem and the problem that's at the core of this. We really have to address this. And while their question is going on, it's much longer than this. Everyone has experienced a Q&A where someone gives a very long working out of something that they're dealing with. But at the mention of the word overpopulation, a kind of murmur goes through the audience. I hear someone behind me just go, yes, and kind of like experience this as if it were a kind of thing that elucidated so much that was important. And at the end of the question, the audience actually burst out into applause, right? And so it doesn't much matter that Kolbert had a judicious, if not exactly politically satisfying response. That to me just signals that she's got this question a lot of times before. What's more interesting to me is that, this was an audience not of like out and out fascists, but of white liberal Midwesterners mostly. who probably think of themselves as environmentalists or as on the left side of the spectrum. And yet the diffuseness of this assumption and its centrality to environmental movements has primed many aspects of the population to be ready for kind of authorizing or excusing certain kinds of punitive state actions that would be associated with controlling population. In the more contemporary moment, another example, and this one will be a little bit briefer, is just the documentary, the Michael Moore documentary, produced documentary, The Planet of Humans, which came out on Earth Day of last month, April 2020. The film purports to kind of expose the fallacy of renewable energy as being ecologically benign. And there's something of the truth buried in the film. A capitalist organization of renewable energy isn't going to produce ecological justice because it's premised on the same kind of systems of exploitation, exhaustion, and dispossession that any other energy system would be. And yet the thesis of the film immediately becomes muddled as about 40 minutes into the film, the filmmaker Jeff Webb says, every expert we talked to basically agreed that the same underlying problem of population or population growth is to blame. And they cut to a series of academics and experts who say, it's something similar. It's really the elephant in the room. Why aren't we talking about this? We have to deal with population. Understated in all of these assumptions is dealing with population, of course, entails all these kinds of rehabilitation of all of these kinds of colonial projects of controlling mostly the bodies of women in the global south, of people of color. And yet I think it's kind of interesting that they frame it in this way, that every expert they talked to said this, and that I wonder the degree to which that indicates, I mean, the film, is not that interesting beyond that, but it kind of indicates that perhaps the purported recognized experts, either of ecological politics, as well as many of the institutions attempting to deal with planetary ecological crisis, global climate change, through the United Nations or other sorts of international organizations, WHO, all these kind of Bill Gates projects, do take overpopulation or population growth as one of the problems that they're trying to solve, right? And despite the fact that they don't say the quiet part loud, like some of the more out and out right-wing movements do, I think that what Out of the Woods is particularly worried about and interested in foregrounding is how some of these assumptions end up at the same place. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up, I mean, I think that the consequence of such analysis is that, we really have to think about the ways in which these tendencies of, as I said, of the structure of capitalism and colonialism precipitate, encourage, and reward, the formation of reactionary individuals and movements, as well as policies. And counter that, we can't simply offer a kind of perpetuation of the present with a green sheen, but instead need an alternative critique of capitalist maldistribution, an alternative proposition for a world of abundance and commonality that isn't predicated on this kind of lifeboat ethics or a desire for depopulation, desire to see the tragedy of the commons play out as if it weren't a myth in and of itself. So we don't just need open borders, but no borders, or as the Red Nation and others have put it, no ban on stolen land, as part of a central plank of what communism or ecological communism might look like today and in the future. A serious response to any kind of purported eco-fascism isn't just opposition and dismissal, but a dismantling of the desires and infrastructures of world coloniality that prop it up. Okay, so we wanted to talk a little bit then, not ending on that note, but about the title of the book, Hope Against Hope, and what that means. Dave or Sophie, maybe this will be more of a group chat, but do one of you want to start us off with that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So hope against hope's a phrase that has been kind of playing around our collective mind for quite a while. Clearly, ecological crisis can often lead us to despair and to fear, and that is completely understandable. But those effective modes, those orientations to the world, can be self-fulfilling prophecies. Fear kind of plays into a Hobbesian narrative, and despair can lead into a political quietism. We're not against them at all, and we don't think that hope is in some way superior necessarily. We think it's possible to be hopeful and despairing, or hopeful and fearing, maybe at the same time or in different times at different moments. But nonetheless, when we see how people are capable of coming together in moments of disaster and against disaster as a structure or condition, we think that's hopeful. So hope for us, the hope that we espouse, the hope that we position against hope, is a hope that is generated by the collective struggle of people, often by those most feeling the sharp end of colonial capitalist white supremacy and the ecological crisis that it's wrought. And the hope that we pitch it against is quite different. In the US, I think people will be very familiar with, Kai, when we were talking about this the other day, sort of spoke about hope fatigue after the Obama years, and the audacity of hope, which turned out more to be the banality of hope. I'm just going to attempt to share my screen to show something that kind of I think captures this quite nicely in the UK. Oh, I can't share my screen. I can describe it though. It's a cartoon from the London Evening Standard during the beginning of lockdown, as it's been called. Although I think it's important to take into account Angela Davis's critique of that term, that lockdown is a prison term, disproportionately a method of punishment used on Black incarcerated people, and that is not what we're experiencing at the moment. But at the beginning of people being encouraged to stay at home and not travel to work and make unnecessary journeys out of the house in the UK, the London Evening Standard published this cartoon, and it's got the London Transport logo, which you'll probably be familiar with, the red circle with the blue band through the middle, and it normally has the name of the station on the London Underground written in that blue band. And it has, in place of the name of the station, it has schools, pubs, shops, theatres, restaurants, and underneath it says closed. And then the final one through the middle, it says hope, and underneath it says open. And this cartoon in a right-wing newspaper edited by George Osborne, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, the architect of austerity, all-round right-wing shithouse, I think really talks about the way that hope can be this depoliticized, Pollyanna-ish faith that everything will be okay. I used to work in utopian studies, the academic field, and I've sat through a lot of papers which are like, God, everything's crap, isn't it? But it'd be okay if we just have a bit of hope. Hope functions as this essentialist kind of principle of, if we just have a bit of hope, things will be fine. So the hope there comes first, and it floats free of any grounding in political action, in solidarity, and in collectivity. And as Obama and this cartoon have made very clear, it's very easily captured and mobilized by the nation state. There's a text that's been going around in the UK that's gone quite viral. It was shared by Sir Alan Sugar, the UK host of The Apprentice, and again, another all-round right-wing shithouse. And it accuses people of being too negative, too miserable about COVID-19 and the government response. It says, these people are getting in the way of the optimism and hope of the British people. So here, I think we see something else, which is the conflation of hope with confidence or optimism, or the belief that everything will be okay. We follow Ernst Bloch, the great philosopher of hope, and other people who've written about Bloch, like Darren Webb, Jose Esteban Munoz, who insist that hope is not confidence, it's not optimism, and it's not expectation. It's not a belief that things will be okay, but a knowledge that we have the materials to make them okay. So that's the hope that we're for, and the hope that we're against. And hopefully that animates the project as a whole, and the writing that's in the book. I'll hand over to Sophie if she's got anything else she wants to add on that.
Yeah, no, I like that we were going to just riff about this. You've said everything I would have said. I think it's it's a dialectical title, and it's also got that sort of little jokiness to it for me, that we hope for something better than hope, right? Because a little bit like the reproductive futurist model of politics, I mean, in which in fact the child becomes not just the scion of, the future, whereas children in fact exist in the present and deserve utopia now, just like anybody does, just like we do, just like in fact they are we, but they become scions of hope as well, right? Like and that's not actually very exciting. It's not enough for us, right? So we say, I mean, at least for me, that's part of the title. Maybe we all as in the collective have a different sort of interpretation of our title, but for me it's also about hoping for something better than hope, hope against, hope to finally get out of this kind of hope framework.
Kai, did you want to add something, or are we moving into question?
Yeah, let's do some questions.
Okay, great. Well, that was fantastic as just a review of sort of the project, where you've some of the key concepts that you explore in the book, and how you work together. And I really like how you both talked about the title, which is, I think, so it is great for sort of conveying, I think, very succinctly all of the kind of complications and the sort of ambivalence toward the word hope. And what you're saying reminds me a lot of also the prison abolitionist Mariam Kaba's, who says hope is a discipline, not in the sense of sort of disciplinary, but it's a practice that you have to sort of like continually renew, and not a thing that you just sort of like, cheerily post up as like the answer to all the world's problems. But so we're gonna go to some questions that are coming in from our audience. And the first one, I think, picks up really nicely on a lot of what Kai was describing in terms of some of the aspects of proto-fascism and the kind of reactionary strains of a lot of environmentalism. And the question is directed to Sophie, but I think I'm going to add a couple of questions that I think are sort of relevant to the things you're talking about more broadly. So the question is, Sophie, how does your work on kinship intertwine with the out-of-the-woods eco-communist orientation? Interested because the usual version of this nexus is often a liberal and/or fascist racialized Malthusianism, of the sort that Kai, I think, was describing there, with the fixation on overpopulation that you see in people like Hardin, and so on. So maybe Sophie can start us off, but I'd be curious to hear, since you all have sort of been thinking and writing about various figurations of that kind of racialized Malthusianism, it would be great to hear any thoughts you might have on that, but then maybe also a little bit on sort of kinship in particular. And you talk about kithnness as sort of a basis for solidarity. And so I wonder if maybe someone, all of you, any of you wants to take up a little bit that question of sort of what kinship might mean in a disaster communism framework, and what kithnness, what you see as kithnness, and how that might inform our understanding of solidarity and where it comes from and how we can start to build it.
Thanks. Yes, I'll start us off. So in my work around well, things like my book Full Surrogacy Now, thanks whoever asked that question. I obviously am interested. I'm part of a wider, albeit not particularly massive yet, attempt to revive the old communist dream of abolishing the family. And this isn't what I center in, or in fact, the other people interested in this, who will be on a panel next week, Michelle O'Brien, Kate Doyle-Griffiths isn't joining us, but Jules Gleason as well. We're interested in questions of sort of classic queer social reproduction. I say classic because in fact this isn't some sort of new idea. It's really sort of from the utopian socialists of the 19th century and so on. But what isn't usually kind of included so much in this is the deeply sort of ecological necessity of abolishing the family. It's not it's infrastructural, and it's affective, and it's material. If we continue to try and subsist, and I mean, of course, some people thrive in sort of in private nuclear households, but if you look at it, you know, without the ideology of sort of family values as glasses on, I think it becomes inevitable. You have to conclude that thriving is despite that structure when it occurs within that structure, rather than because of it. And it is completely unsustainable in more ways than one to sort of predicate the reproduction, or as we would prefer to say, regeneration of life, of daily life, of populations, and you know, the actual manufacture of human beings on tiny little units, you know, of isolated consumption, where everything is always duplicated, and every little box, despite the fact that it's just a few yards away from the next one, has its own, you know, food production infrastructure and its own laundry stuff and everything is always duplicated like this. So the idea of the collective creche, of the sort of the collective kitchen, the protest kitchen is in fact what Michelle O'Brien thinks is perhaps, in her sort of tongue-in-cheek proposal for 6 steps to abolish the family, where the sort of mass sort of insurgency might grow from. The experience of collective social reproduction in the protest kitchen might be where we begin this kind of expansion movement. But so what I've noticed is, you know, so having had a little bit of training in environmental thought and even policy, that there is a sort of way in which multi-species feminism, as it's known, unfortunately doesn't get adopted sufficiently within sort of Marxist and socialist conversations, and in fact it gets assumed to be somehow liberal, I think. The idea, so by multi-species feminism, I mean, or queer ecologies, you know, the ensemble of sort of attentive, kind of granular sort of inquiries into how, you know, we, quote unquote, you know, humans are sort of co-imbricated with non-humans in sort of relations of potentially caring antagonism, not necessarily sort of pretty relations, but sort of relations of co-constitutiveness, co-production, and so on. And that's kind of the key for me of sort of looking at kinship within the human as well, because in fact even our kin are not our kin, really. I mean, even our kin have to be made kin. So kin is always made, not given. So by that I mean, for instance, you know, a fetus, you know, inside your abdomen is in a, you know, relation of sort of quite brutal and mutually quite dangerous sort of visceral entangledness. It's not a sort of, so when we say family as a metaphor for how to treat one another ecologically, I'm not necessarily even knee-jerk opposed to that. I just don't think it says what we think it says, because family is a very good idea in principle. I just don't think it's particularly realized. We all know what we want when we say treat someone as family, you know, and in the COVID era, a lot of politicians and officials have suggested we treat one another as family. But if you look at the statistics of where the majority of worldly sort of abuse and even in many categories murder take place, it's within family. So if we were, in fact, to treat everybody as we treat family, that would be a net negative, and I am not for it. And I don't think anyone should be suggesting that in that sense. But if we were to think about, so yeah, there's this proposal to some of us are making to revive the term kith, because in the phrase kith and kin, which used to, sorry, I'm going on too long, but kith is the alternative to kin that we have to describe relations forged through action and in relation to place. And so if we were to think about the relations we have as not necessarily pretty, certainly not given, but sort of to stay with, the sort of the Donna Haraway idea of staying with the trouble seems to me to be part of this, because in a sense, I sometimes face the criticism that family abolitionism is sort of irresponsible in a way, because it seeks the chosen, the idea of the chosen family, which is what queer people, particularly queer youth, expelled, as refugees from the private nuclear household, if you like, have required for their survival. But in a sense, there is a lot that we do not simply choose. We make history, but not under conditions of our own choosing, as Marx said. And of course, that is also crucial. That is also key to kith for me. Kith is the fact that we wish to make our households and choose, in a sense, the way we live and how we reproduce. But there is so much going on already that is making us. We are the makers of one another, and we need to learn how to act like it. Okay, I'll just stop.
Yeah, I'm just going to take up that idea you just ended with, Sophie, and just add one little other thing. And so, I mean, I think that like part of what you're getting at is the kind of relationship that kin and kith seeks to elucidate is one of obligation in a certain kind of way. And that's where its politics, its expansive politics lie. And I think that we have to mention that like a lot of some important alternative models of thinking about kinship beyond the Euro-American human amongst various different kinds of indigenous thinkers and ontologies also bear implications for how we think about ecological crisis. So when someone like Kim Tallbear talks about the way that extended kinship is something that the settler heteropatriarchal family seeks to destroy as part of the settler colonial project, that's not only that extended kinship involves destroying relationships with land and various non-human nations that are that well exceed what usually gets filed in under kinship. Now, there's an enormous amount of work that would have to go into to beginning to recompose for and amongst non-Indigenous people, the fact that we're completely not obligated to the relationships to land and its history, and it's at least speaking as a settler myself, our own sort of implication in that history. And so maybe like some of these kin and kith and comrade and other sorts of conversations happening around how can we relate to one another and to other beings in a more expansive way might be provisional ways of getting around and through that situation.
Dave, do you want to add anything, or should we head on to the next question?
Yeah, take another question. I've got some thoughts, but I can maybe weave them in if there's a chance. But I think Kai and Sophie have covered that really nicely.
Fantastic. Okay, so this next question is on both a specific piece and sort of thinking through disaster communism a bit more. So I'm gonna the first part of the question is sort of posed in relation to a one of the Out of the Woods pieces. So I will go through it and maybe you can unpack the piece a little bit and then address the question. So in Communization and Concrete Utopia, you pose disaster communism as communization through two moments, a la Harry Cleaver. One, the history of struggle prior to the disaster moment, and two, disaster producing breakdown in state administration and authority. So the question is, would you provide some empirical examples that you would affirm as a sort of disaster communism through these two moments? And then I wonder if you might also distinguish, go into how this sort of frame of communization might be distinguished from other communization theories, like a endnotes framework that's kind of a more oriented towards negation. How do you see, or maybe you don't, maybe you wouldn't agree with that characterization, but how would you sort of position your view of disaster communism and what it means for communization within other strains?
Great, thanks. That's a really good question. I'll preface this answer by saying that I think I'm right in saying that none of the three of us on this call were involved in Out of the Woods when that piece was written. So I hope we can do justice to those who were. So in terms of the empirical kind of side of the question, if I've understood it correctly, I think what a really interesting example, and Kai can maybe speak to this a little bit more, is in response to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico or Boriken, where there have been and there are ongoing, incredibly inspiring mutual aid programs that have gone well beyond just providing the what would be counted as like the necessities of life. They've instigated new communal relations, musical events, collective food happenings, new forms of sociality that go beyond mere survival and kind of move towards flourishing and discovering what we're capable of doing when we work together. And the areas where those have really taken off are the areas where there were established mutual aid relationships already, and where there were infrastructures and platforms and people experienced in mutual aid. And it's not that everyone involved was an expert in mutual aid or had a direct experience of these forms, but that those infrastructures and knowledges provided a pedagogical function when it became a necessity for a greater number of people. That's only one example, and obviously it's a lot to extrapolate from that to a more general principle. I think the current situation around with COVID-19 could be really interesting, and I think what the New Socialist, I've seen a publication here in the UK, has begun to kind of play a kind of live archival role, in a sense, collecting testimonies and experiences of mutual aid groups, the tensions. The local mutual aid Facebook group in Nottingham, where I live, has a lot of people, how do I get the cops out this person's son? But it's not what anyone would understand as mutual aid, and yet there are people being politicized in much more positive ways through it. And the New Socialists are collecting accounts, essentially. So I think we could have that's going to be a really important project going forwards in that regard. On the kind of communization question and how we understand negation and the importance of negation or not, I would be wary. I don't think I have the knowledge to necessarily situate us alongside or against other communization currencies. I think we draw from them, we're inspired by them, but we're not engaged in a kind of academic or quasi-academic or intra-communization positioning game of this is what these people say, but we're different because X. And actually that's one of the things that I've found quite liberating about thinking with Out of the Woods. Clearly, though, the communization tendency as a whole is really important for us. And on negation, a really useful answer to this question I found is in David Eden's book, Autonomy, which is a sort of critical survey of autonomous Marxism. And he sort of looks at the debate between those who privilege the no, those who privilege the yes, or the negation and the affirmation. And he sort of says, as long as you've got both, it doesn't necessarily matter. A no is a yes and a yes is a no. And I think broadly we would share that. And that's why we kind of use this framework of within, against, and beyond as a kind of trialectic, where each term strengthens the other. So we're inspired by action that takes place within the present and draws on the present, including some of the shitty things of the present. So we talk about bricolage, making use with what's at hand, including sometimes technologies that have horrible, unpleasant origins. And generating new forms of living, flourishing, socializing within the present. But those forms are useless unless they also operate against the present. The state's quite happy for people to take on the role of looking after themselves during a disaster because it relieves them of responsibility. So we need that within needs to be positioned against as well. And it needs to be oriented beyond, and it might also think with the beyond. So with utopian heuristic visions of futures that are different, not as blueprints, but as calls to hope more and hope better, to kind of riff on what Sophie said earlier. So I hope that provides a sketch of an answer, if not a fully fleshed out one.
Yeah, can I add one little thing? It'll be very, very brief. I just want to say, like, the Puerto Rico example is so, I mean, it's so important, and I really hope that people are not, forgetting that, the United States is an imperial force, of course, but also that that the mutual aid networks built in the prior to and in the wake of Maria were also a huge source for the organizing that happened, in the years afterwards and led to the Ricky Renuncia movement. And I think that we get this idea sometimes floating around that mutual aid is just about sharing some food or Venmoing someone or something. And then that's the extent of it, as if there's not any kind of power being built and relationships being built in those situations, which is, I think, wrong, I guess. And this book in particular is really good at laying that out. Aftershocks of disaster, Puerto Rico before and after the storm.
So that's actually a great lead into the next question, which is very much follows on this. And Dave talked a little bit about sort of touch on some of this in the answer, but the question is if you would all speculate a bit about disaster communist strategies for a post-COVID situation, or I guess suppose a not post-COVID, maybe during, a within COVID situation. And what would these movements and organizations look like? And maybe, are we, where do you see disaster communism happening or not happening now? And how can we sort of try to amplify the strains that we do see?
I'll give some preliminary thoughts. So clearly, I think we're seeing what we would have expected to see to an extent, and what Rebecca Solnit has outlined, that people are caring for each other. Not often, I think, out of a particular political commitment, but because people do care, and there is no fixed human nature. Our lives are not necessarily nasty, brutish, and short in the absence of a state or a functioning state. And so we're seeing incredible relationships of care and support and solidarity, but they, in and of themselves, are insufficient. They're people with abhorrent political views are being caring for their neighbours and for people they didn't previously know. So I think it's an open question as to where this goes. I think what's interesting, though, is the expansion of these relations of care beyond people who would ever have heard of mutual aid, and the potential pedagogic function that plays. So in the UK, we know that the recent expansion of fracking to areas of England in particular that are very genteel, middle to upper class, saw new kinds of people entering into activism. They didn't, initially from quite a NIMBY-ish, regressive political position, but through engagement with climate activists more broadly who perhaps travel from further afield, there was a kind of pedagogic function there, and ideas were transmitted to people who might not otherwise have encountered them. And there is now a lasting legacy of that. It's not always positive. I think it's fed into things like Extinction Rebellion, which in the UK is we've written extensively and very critically about, but it has transmitted ideas to places they wouldn't normally have gone. So I think there's an opportunity there. I think numerous mutual aid groups are doing incredible work, both in helping people survive, but also in providing joy, providing food that's not just the bare essentials, but that's exciting and different from what people might normally eat, and brings them, opens up new forms of connection. So I think it's a moment of huge potential. It's too early, I think, to say where that's going to go. I think it also shows up some of the limits of the state, or at least particular forms of the state. So in the UK, one of the problems they're having implementing track and trace, so developing this app that will allow people who've been in contact with someone who's got coronavirus to be made aware, and also using other strategies like talking to people about who they've been in contact with so they can be informed. The fact that the technology is not secure is frightening people. It's, this technology can be used in incredibly authoritarian ways, and there is widespread, not necessarily particularly anarchist, but widespread mistrust of what the government might do with that data that I think will hamper people downloading it, quite rightly. But also in those attempts to talk with people about where, who they've been in contact with and so on, the people doing that work often don't have local knowledge. And track and trace experts who work in sexual health, one thing they've said is that you need to be knowledgeable of a particular community in order to get their trust and to ask the right kinds of questions. So the kind of very top-down centralized approach that the UK government in particular is taking is not working, and a more municipal or distributed or bottom-up form of organization that can be that goes genuinely bottom-up and can be joined up on a large scale, I think is a lesson that we need to take. I don't know quite who takes forward that lesson. I think there's really interesting stuff in kind of about mutual aid and healthcare, but clearly at the moment it's the question for the left. We don't have the structures and the organizations who can implement those kinds of policies, strategies rather. You're muted, Sophie.
I thought I was pressing the space bar like a pro. Just wanted to say some things really quickly off the top of my head, because I think, I think I'll let Kai talk more about really empirical things, but just sort of vaguely, I think this is, the pandemic is a really open, in some ways, hope against hopeful kind of moment, because of all the movement that seems to be happening, germinating, possible, potentialized in places like meat and slaughterhouse workers unions, or around anti-raids and deportations actions being and initiatives being put forward by communities, because of course the state wants to say that heightened surveillance and stronger borders are good medicine in this situation, just like they're good medicine, as Naomi Klein has instructively kind of shown us in all situations of shock and crisis, right? And of course, and this is my angle around the centrality of the figure of the family to the regime of nature, that, you know, Out of the Woods is trying to contest the heteronormative notion of the family. You know, we've been told that the solution to this you know, situation is to go back to the, you know, the where else, the family, to stay home, to social distance, to take social distance from whom, right? And to shelter in place, well, whose place? And in fact, you know, although there is a large scale buy-in, you know, there is also a hell of a lot of potential here, and you can see already the realization that this is just, it just doesn't work. It is just not adequate. This infrastructure that is proposed, this kind of natural solution to the predicament and the danger, supposedly, you know, the nuclear private household, just clearly isn't working, and people are seeing that and are doing something about it, right? Because people are, and this is not, you know, the solution. I mean, I don't think, you know, simply, you know, bottom-up attempts to redistribute food and sort of take care labor responsibilities into our own hands is the solution. But I, you know, and I would also note that sort of, you know, political candidates who are talking about a vast reduction in work, I think are potentially going to do well in this moment, because there are big campaigns just ready to happen here to sort of, you know, to think more radically and in a more utopian way about you know, the conditions of possibility for survival, let alone thriving in this context, because it is purely because we live in a you know, in a world in which you have to go to work in order to be able to eat, that we're seeing, you know, people getting on crowded buses to do their commute or whatever, which is then in turn sort of very moralistically sort of censured by the very powers that are making it necessary. So, you know, I'll just, seizing the means of ecological regeneration right now seems to be, in some sense, you know, and this is an Out of the Woods kind of thing, you know, communism both already is here and needs to be really actualized. But, you know, we're seeing I actually find my political mood quite ambivalent and in some ways quite excited at the moment. I might disavow that like tomorrow, but you know.
Yeah. I tend to be a little bit more terrified, but I do think that, so what would it actually mean to seize the means of ecological regeneration, right? I think that like we get closer, or we see glimpses, you know, in these moments of the kinds of relationships that we would want to have in a present and future ecological communism. But there are huge problems that we haven't yet figured out how to wedge our way into, really. And so, like, you know, I think that in the thing that this COVID situation is really making me think about more and more is food. And, you know, we talk in a couple of chapters of the book about how global famine is not a product of scarcity, but a product of maldistribution. We see this right now, where people are going hungry at the same time as potatoes and onions are rotting in fields, and we see meat shortages at the same time as animals are being euthanized, because the production and distribution markets, as well as the workers who are extra susceptible to getting the virus due to the working conditions in meat packing plants, are just not, they're not built for this, you know. So this isn't the last kind of crisis in industrial global agriculture that we'll hear, and yet that kind of crisis can be used in all different kinds of ways. So the UN, you know, issued this report a couple of weeks ago where they're anticipating like cascading famines around the world. And yet, like, it's very difficult for my mutual aid network, which I think is dope as shit, to solve that problem, right? And so I think that some of this conversation, it goes back to the earlier question in some kind of ways, is how do we relate to, you know, also this question of counter logistics, which has some, you know, in sometimes has some questions to do with the state and international trade, and other times has to do with material infrastructures of food distribution and the like. I'm quite happy that there are more and more kind of local and community food networks that are, participating in and supporting mutual aid networks, and yet the scale of the problem and the immense unequal distribution among various parts of the world makes it very difficult for us to imagine, or for me to imagine, I should say at the very least, how we get from in glimpses of disaster communism to global revolutionary redistribution of ecological well-being and flourishing. Nonetheless, I mean, I think that some of these conversations are happening in other places and spots, of course, and what the kind of continued focus on food also, and in this situation also helps us understand, is that the degrees and varieties of ecological crisis aren't just about climate change in a simplistic sort of fashion, or a complex fashion, but they're about all different kinds of exhaustion. The nitrogen and phosphorus cycles are so out of whack right now that it's not as exciting to talk about them, but perhaps equally as important if we want to avoid the real kind of imposition of a kind of right-wing austerity kind of depopulation future. And so we have a massive amount to learn from peasants movements and movements in the global South, who have centered not just organic food or something, but redistribution of land, of collective decision-making processes in food growing and distribution, of the different kinds of techniques and technologies for sustaining large amounts of people with small areas of land, so on and so forth. And we should recognize that humbly, and not think that disaster communism is just more cornfields or something. I don't really know.
Yeah, and I think that brings in a question that we've been thinking about, which is about how we take our conversations out, away from the perspectives that we're familiar with and the locations we're familiar with. And in the UK, certainly at the moment, there's a lot of interest in Kerala's response to coronavirus, the South Indian state, which has a population of 35 million and has had only 4 deaths from COVID-19. And there's widespread praise of the Keralan government, which is a communist government, at least ostensibly. And I know very, very little about it. And I think this is something, it's a conversation we need to have that needs to involve people with direct experience of Keralan politics. Clearly, and this goes back to this question of how, as disaster communists, and communists in the sense of abolitionists, how we engage with forms of left politics that we might differ from, but have some sympathy with. The Keralan government hasn't abolished cops. In fact, cops have been praised for their role in helping combat coronavirus there. So I think there are really important questions here. If we say that Kerala has done something admirable that might be replicable in other parts of the world, and it seems at least likely that that's the case, what can we learn from that? But as abolitionists, how do we remain critical of the fact it still is a statist response? It still involves the police. They still have prisons. Kerala is not a fully communist utopia. So I think those are really kind of pertinent questions for us. It's not just as disaster communists what strategies and tactics and forms of organization do we use, but how do we relate to, parasite upon, draw from, nourish, and sometimes perhaps exist in conflict and tension with other currents that we might be sympathetic but critical to, or that we might be critical but a bit sympathetic to. from social democracy through to statist socialism, yeah. I think that's something that I think we're keen to do more thinking around, and to bring in other voices to do that thinking with.
Well, that also really leads nicely into the next question, which is about what it looks like to implement agro-techno-ecology against capital. And I think sometimes you've discussed this in terms of cyborg agroecology or cyborg ecology. So the question is about how that's to be done, how can it scale? Maybe you can also explain what you mean with the term cyborg agroecology. And then I'm going to combine that with another question that I think sort of touches on some similar themes. And that, since I know both Kai and Dave are sort of starting to talk about how this might apply to things like food systems. But I think there are broader questions around how you're thinking about nature, which is such an important theme throughout the Out of the Woods project. And so the other question is, you once wrote about reclaiming the oikos in relation to moving beyond the nature-society binary. So how do you think forms of everyday living, but also revolutionary practices might change with this synthesis? And do you think that communist and socialist strategies are stuck ecologically because of this binary, the nature-society binary? So how might we think about that differently? And maybe you can also say something there about just how you think we communists and socialists and those on the left have tended to think about the nature society binary, and why you felt that was such an important thing to address, because I think that's one of the things that's very striking about your approach to all of these questions.
Okay, who wants to start? Me?
You can take it in parts if you want to start with cyborg agroecology and then kind of broaden out into nature and society. Feel free.
Okay, so yeah, I'll start there, and Dave and Sophie can riff on whatever I say and tell me I'm wrong or something. I mean, I think that just like I was saying in that tail end of that last question, part of what we learn from other sorts of ways of organizing agriculture and food production outside of the kind of dominant, either the dominant capitalist framework or its supposed alternatives like organic food. What we learned from those movements is a kind of thoughtful, practiced, and experimental mode of engaging with ecologies and ecological systems that goes beyond a kind of simplistic binary between good natural food and bad technological frankenfood that has dominated the way in which both environmentalisms in the global north as well as ecological Marxisms have thought about food production in some kind of way. I'm not like a food expert in the same way as, well, I'm not an expert about anything, but I mean, I think that this serves our sort of riff on how some of these alternative practices use different technologies and techniques suggests that what they're doing and what's interesting about what they're doing isn't that they're choosing nature instead of choosing technology or modernity or something like that, as if that's a choice that anyone can make or any group of people can make so easily, but that they're choosing non-capitalist and anti-capitalist practices against the sort of imposed, oftentimes imperial constructions of agricultural systems. So learning from La Via Campesina, from the Zapatistas and others who practice different forms of permaculture and other sorts of agricultural techniques, we never really see the kind of anti-technological sort of orientation that a lot of environmentalisms in the global north sort of are premised on. And I guess our take on that is that, and as you say, one of the ways in which we really maybe differ from some other kinds of ecological Marxisms is simply that that you run into people run into major problems when they think that the reason that capitalism is bad is that it alienates us from some prior harmonious relationship to nature that usually in the global north means things like that nuclear family, things like a back to the land sort of movement for white people and so on and so forth. This is not to say that anyone who works within a kind of framework of alienation falls into this. It's just to suggest that one of the reasons why we were interested in actually looking at some of these agricultural practices is for that kind of reason. Maybe that leads into the question of how everyday life might be different and might be organized different in different landscapes in different parts of the world in a more ecologically just communist future. But certainly from the perspective of social movements, it means we can't sort of reinforce the all too easy moral decision that nature can be easily found and is always benign and associated with rurality and small clustered communities and so on and so forth, and then consequently cities and technology and urbanization and density and so on and so forth are bad. That's kind of what we're trying to get out of. I don't know what that's getting us into necessarily. So is that something that one of you all want to take up, or?
I'm happy to say a little bit. Yeah, I think Kai's done a really good job of outlining the broad approach there. I think, as we said right at the start, a lot of our project implicitly is about rejecting a whole series of binaries that all too often structure debate around ecological or environmental politics. So it's the small versus the large, the local versus the global, the fast versus the slow, the accelerating versus the braking, nature versus culture, and a whole other series of binaries. Sophie and I wrote a review of Inventing the Future, which not as out of the woods, but very much in keeping, I think, with a lot of the thought that we offer as out of the woods. And we sort of expanded on it a little bit more in that. But really, we think these binaries are unhelpful. And they are so deeply ingrained. So, if you critique by virtue of being a critique of accelerationists, I've been accused of wanting to kind of dance around the campfire, and like as if if you're not an accelerationist, you have to be a primitivist. And the Out of the Woods project is really quite firmly driving against these binary oppositions. And the original title of the Cyborg agroecology essay was Cyborg Ecology, and we've renamed it for the book because we see that the kind of agricultural debates that we're entering into there around organic versus GM as one subset or one kind of set of binary oppositions that belong to a whole broader set that we are trying to abolish, and that cyborg ecology might be the name of an approach that rejects those structuring binaries. It's not it's by no means necessarily it's clearly not a new approach. This is these binaries are deeply colonial. They emerge through and with settler colonialism, and often they fall apart as well at the limits of settler colonialism. I mean, indigenous peoples were not considered part of culture, but were considered part of nature. It's these binaries are not sustainable in any way, and of course, indigenous cosmologies, knowledges, ways of living across the globe that persist very often reject these binary oppositions, including things around gender as well. Third genders, a number of indigenous nations and societies don't subscribe to the Western binary gender system. So I think, yeah, we need to acknowledge that this isn't something we're plucking out of thin air or kind of coming up with anew. It's drawing on and in dialogue with, in some cases, very old ways of knowing, understanding, and engaging with the world.
Yeah, I mean, so I also am not one of the out of the woodsers who crunches numbers around agroecology particularly, but I can say that the common approach we share is sort of influenced by, yeah, like those, you know, decolonial kinds of thinkers who sort of reject many of those sort of either ors that are kind of forced on contemporary environmentalists a lot. Like, are you for or against, you know, geoengineering? Are you for or against like GMO? Are you for or against, you know, nuclear, and so on and so forth? And you know, the question sets up a sort of notion that there is this kind of you know, kind of natural way of doing relations with the non-human or whatever, which then gets kind of taken over by capitalist technology. And of course, you know, technology is predominantly being deployed to capitalist ends right now, but that seeds, I think, for Out of the Woods' taste way too much ground, and we're interested in you know, like taking over those means of ecological regeneration and doing bricolage and rejecting the idea of an innocent, a pure, or an uncontaminated sort of form of food production, for one example. But you know, famines aren't natural. There is no such, you know, there are no natural disasters. But also, I would say the reduction of quality to quantity is something then I can link back as well to the population thing. You know, when Donna Haraway, who I respect and I'm in conversation with, and am really appreciative of in terms of actually her non-defensiveness and willingness to sort of do comradely disagreement about this stuff. But you know, when she says make kin, not babies, I you know, have tried to express, and we've ended up putting this in the book as well. I wrote an essay that sort of attempted to say that Haraway's own approach was what enabled me to reject that slogan, and yeah, to sort of reject that reduction of quality to quantity. It's not about for me asking people to make fewer babies, because we don't even know whether that would actually result, in a sense, like, to be a bit facetious about it, in smaller families. Because you know, you could have, for me, it's about what a family is. You could have much larger households and fewer babies, and cool the climate. I do agree increasingly that there is something to be to be said about our in the global north, our decisions around manufacturing new human beings. I think we should do this communally for you know, if for no other reason than for the fact that it's an extreme sport, is pregnancy, and it needs a lot of support, and what comes after it's finished requires a lot of work as well. So let's be anti-work and distribute that as much as possible. But so okay, but the question was cyborg agroecology, and you know, and Alyssa, please feel free to just, you know, say no, that's not my job here. But I would love to ask you to articulate, you know, what that phrase, even if it's not precisely the one you use. I know that you have a hell of a lot of research recently completed on the question of nature's so-called free gifts, and a really, you know, you've you know, basically conducted an investigation leading to an intervention in political theory that will put environment sort of at the core of our analysis of capitalism in a new way. So whether you feel comfortable commenting on that, or whether rather you would just perhaps like to articulate a bit about how you see your project with the Green New Deal and the Planet to Win as differing from ours, and what the points in common are, because I know there are lots of people quite hungry to hear that. Yeah, that would be really educational for me.
Thank you. Yeah, I will probably focus more on the sort of the Green New Deal question and sort of the difference, I guess, or I should think more probably commonalities, or I see a lot of commonalities in the approach that we took in A Planet to Win and what I see in Out of the Woods. But I will say briefly on the sort of free gifts question. I mean, this is something that you see in Marx, of course, like the free gifts of nature, and that is in a lot of people who have been using Marx to write about like the place of nature in capitalism. But I think that one of the things that the agroecology question brings up is the question of how you treat gifts not as free but as reciprocal, and how we can start to have a kind of a different view of like what that relationship is as a reciprocal relationship between humans and non-humans, and not a sort of just constant taking and assuming that like nature is what provides. But that is a whole conversation unto itself. So what I'm going to say briefly on the sort of Green New Deal question is, so we wrote this book, A Planet to Win, about making sort of the case for what we think of as a radical Green New Deal. And I am very not only sympathetic to, but agree with many of the criticisms of the Green New Deal as sort of a framework, and especially because I think it's such an amorphous category. And there have been versions of things that people have called the Green New Deal, especially like in the Obama era, that I think were very like basically just like a excuse to give a lot of money to like green tech, to pump money into to subsidize tech capital under the guise of sort of making America number one in green technology and things like that, in a way that has almost nothing to do with what I think we ought to be doing right now. And so one of the reasons we wrote the book is to try to articulate a different vision of what the Green New Deal could and we thought should be. And it's not a term I probably would have chosen myself, but it was sort of like, okay, well, sometimes there are terms out there in the world, and how can you like continue to speak in that language rather than saying like we have a different set of language. But I think one of the things that is probably a difference is maybe I guess in terms of thinking about so I think there are two main differences. One is the state, and two is the time horizon, I guess, because I think in a lot of ways, what we were trying to do in the book was articulate a vision of like what we can do within and hopefully against capitalism, but while recognizing that we are going to be within capitalism in the near future, and that it is actually, I think, imperative to start bringing carbon emissions down without sort of the overcoming of capitalism entirely. And so how can we imagine something that in the next 10, 20 years can start to do some of that while recognizing it's like a partial step towards a larger vision that I think would correspond probably in a lot of ways with the disaster communism vision. And that is, I think sort of like, I think it is a tough thing to figure out how to be, or one of the things we struggled with is how to be pragmatic, but also have like a radical vision. And I think it's really hard to do that. And we tried to do it, but then, I think a lot of people say, well, this isn't actually pragmatic. This is not going to happen. And also it's not like the full, leap beyond. So I think I don't know. And especially given that the sort of conditions of possibility are constantly shifting, I think it's a real question of like, where do we sort of situate like a radical pragmatism? How do we understand that? What does it mean? And so on. There is a line that you guys have that's about, I think it's survival pending revolution. And I suspect that we would think about that in different ways, but I do think that one of the things we're trying to articulate is something that is like, how do we buy time, buy time against sort of this ongoing process of, as you point out, uneven and differentiated ecological crisis that is going to be, I think, ongoing, whether or not we have a Green New Deal, whether or not we, make it to disaster communism and so on, but like that this is something that we have to really be, I think, how can we be trying to stave off some of the worst elements of that while also, recognizing that some of it is going to happen. And I think on the state, I mean, it's obviously like one of the questions facing, well, I wouldn't just say now, always facing the left. How do we think about and relate to the state in our, fight against capital and or the state at all times? And so it's like, I think with that, I have to say, I think I completely agree about the ways that the state is often a force for, not only there's just so many ways that you can talk about the way that the state is not only sort of adding a force of oppression and repression, but is enabling the forms of capitalist destruction that we have been discussing, that you've all discussed, that the state works for capital most of the time, and whether that's in sort of the forms of, often sort of simultaneously, and sort of making like giving pipeline permits and repressing indigenous activists struggling against it. You see both the sort of facilitation of capital, and that often means like repression of people who are fighting against it. There's so many instances of things like that. And yet I can't let go of the, I think what I think is that we do have to use parts of it in the meantime, because not using it will also does not make it go away, and doesn't obviate the ways in which I think the neglect of the state can also, the state will continue to act on and against many people, even if we're not engaging it. And in many ways, I think, I spent some time in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and felt like working, in a collective that was doing mutual aid work. And it was both incredibly important and the only thing that was really on the ground for a lot of people. And also, like, the absence of the state meant that the city was rebuilt in a way that meant, thousands of people were never able to return. The city was gentrified. Obviously, thousands of people died because the state did not sort of adequately fulfill duties to evacuate people in advance. And we could say, like, the state shouldn't be doing that in the first place. There are a lot of things that produced that set of relations, such that largely poor and Black people were the ones who were not evacuated, who were living in the most vulnerable places in the city. All of these things that then, as Dave mentioned, you have like the militia going in. That is essentially often, sorry, not the militia, the military, but basically aiding people, white people on the ground who are essentially militias. And so I think this is like a rambling way to say, basically, I think that sort of made it hard for me to see how we don't engage with sort of what we need the state to do in the meantime. Right now, I think like not having something like a public healthcare system in the US, I think has materially contributed to deaths from COVID, which are disproportionately borne by working class people and people of color. I know this is, the UK has the NHS and still has had a really horrific sort of death toll. And so it's obviously not like the state does or doesn't solve the problem. But I think that that's one of the things that at least I, and I think probably my co-authors would say, we see a role that we think the state has to play in the meantime, and that we have to use. And I don't mean to say that you all, I know you all know all of this and are not. I don't mean to say that you wouldn't understand these things. It just, and I think it's a lot of people on the left, I do think can be a little can be glib about the state, where it's just we'll just use it, it's fine, and that I think is a dangerous position to take. So. But I think that those are sort of the areas where probably we have the most difference. But I think that there is so much of the impetus of, I think, what your project is, and certainly what we see our project are, in terms of trying to cut through some of the dichotomous ways of thinking about nature, ecology, how we approach it on the left, how it fits into left projects and visions of the world as it is and as it should be, I think are actually quite, if not totally similar, are very similar, if not totally the same, and absolutely in conversation. And so it's, I think, an extremely important conversation that I'm glad that we're engaged in together in comradely ways. So With that, I'm going to ask our last audience question, and then I guess give you each a couple minutes to just wrap up like some closing words, and then we'll call it a day. So the last question is actually spurred by, so initially it was about what you all think about Planet of the Humans, which Kai mentioned briefly. So maybe, but also how you relate personally and think about the rise of disaster pop culture, film, books, art, and so on. And you do sort of write about this occasionally, like the various figures and figurations of the apocalypse in pop culture and writing and things like that. And so yeah, if you just want to say something about how you think about that, how you think about sort of that, how it informs those kinds of figurations inform our thinking about ecological crisis, about disaster, about what it means to live through and in disaster, and how and maybe, I mean, since a lot of them probably are bad, if you think there are any like really good or like pop culture, film, book, art depictions of disaster that you like or find like to be expressive of something that you would recognize as disaster communism.
Oh, good question.
There's a member of the collective who should really be here, who she looks at that precise question as her main thing. Sorry, it sounds like you were gonna say something.
No.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think collectively we should really have her here right now to answer the question, but I think we collectively understand a lot of cultural production around big disasters and you know, the end of the world in a way that is partly influenced by something Jodie Dean says about the Anthropocenic enjoyment of these scenarios, where there's a sort of affect of almost like smug sort of "I told you so"ism that we get to enjoy when we consume these media. And of course, you know, even before we go into that, I think it's worth saying that you know, the way these stories are shown to us, we're invited to identify with a sort of usually able-bodied, reproductive, heterosexual, white, you know, fairly well-off subject who is experiencing disaster as though it were an event, right? Which is the opposite of what we are trying to do in our theorizing disaster as condition, which comes with all the, you know, understanding disaster as condition leads to nihilism very easily, and that's why we also have to find our way out of those woods. But you know, so I will just quickly flag that although this wasn't something I had done with my out of the woods hat on, I wrote a little critique, which then I put in my book, of the Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, which was being sort of serialized on television. And I think basically the shape of that thought that I had was probably influenced in a way by these conversations we're having, because while that is ostensibly a dystopia, the sort of the premise of a totalitarian sort of state taking over and forcing you know, quote unquote women, i.e. self-evidently this means viable uterus havers, you know, to gestate forcibly for the gentry who own them in couple forms for the sake of a repronormative family unit. That is a dystopia. And although Margaret Atwood says that little bits of this, everything she has in her dystopia have already occurred, she doesn't follow that nearly far enough, because the horror here and the event here is clearly the idea that a non-racialized subject, i.e. a white woman, might be experiencing essentially what Black women on the American plantation as chattel slaves were experiencing. And that, so I was sort of staring at that and realizing that there's some sort of torsion happening here. There's some sort of invitation of the kind of disappointed Trump era, potentially sort of I am with her type subject, you know, who is deeply angry and in search of, you know, affective experiences that really kind of shore up her sense of aggrievedness really, and her desire, which is very understandable. Again, I'm not unsympathetic to any of this, but the desire for a world in which feminism was completely straightforward and simple, and everybody would obviously be a feminist because, you know, the fascists are literally, you know, treating all females the same as slaves, right? So that fantasy of a world where everyone got behind Hillary, God damn it, and, you know, and the fucking, you know, Black feminists and trans feminists weren't kind of causing problems in the movement. You know, that's what I sort of saw in that. And I think there's a similar thing sometimes going on where, in fact, the dystopia of the end of the world is a sort of utopia, paradoxically, for some people, for the people who are being invited to watch it and to enjoy something about it that is simple and pure and not kind of contaminated by the cacophony of dissent and problematization and, you know, requests to sort of, you know, own your privilege or whatever, right? So, and that's why you always have the nuclear family in the disaster at the end of the world, because that's something that you can always supposedly fall back on. Okay, and I won't have any final remarks. Those were my final remarks. Thanks.
So we have about 5 years ago, we started a music mix to kind of look at how these ideas play out in various bits of music. And then we've sat on it for 5 years. We have an essay that kind of explicates the politics of the tracks. The essay is about 5,000 words long, and we're only about halfway through the mix. We're hoping to get it out at some point soon. But it kind of starts with music that actually a lot of us really like, quite a lot of ambient music that sort of positions itself as ecological or environmentally concerned and aware. So there's a really beautiful track called Anthropocene by Loskill, who is, I believe, a Boston-based musician. It's beautiful. But the whole imagination of that album is this kind of humans are the problem, there's too many of us. It's inspired by John Gray, the kind of like misanthropic philosopher. And then it moves through a whole lot of music in a similar kind of vein that sort of imagines the end of the world, and the supposed message is, goodness, we've caused this terrible damage to the world, but it aestheticizes it and it romanticizes it. And I think what it does is it projects the listener, and the listener is normally a sensitive white man, into the future, and then they can kind of play in that future. The future, the ruined future, becomes the playground of the people who've caused the ruin. Cozy catastrophe. The John Wyndham, the Day of the Triffids. Britain's been destroyed by this ecological catastrophe, but somehow the Isle of Wight survived, and all the bourgeoisie can reconvene and have their little utopia on the Isle of Wight. That's slightly unfair on John Wyndham, but that's I think a very dominant strain in music and in some literature as well. And it's a very old strain as well. Think about Diderot's writings on ruins in the late 18th century, the beginning of the Enlightenment. He writes beautifully, and very movingly, about imagining yourself at the end of the world, going forwards in time to the ruins of the civilization around you. But it's white male fantasy that actually reproduces the capitalism it's sort of putatively against. But the mix moves through music we're more kind of, I think, in tune with. Maya Gomez's incredible album, I forget the name of the EP now, but this incredible track called Ex-Narcissist. The whole EP is sort of inspired by a statement of hope in the face of her incarceration in a migrant detention centre in the UK, and the forms of solidarity that they experienced in detention. And the mix moves through all kinds of different kinds of music that we would see as ecological, even if it's not explicitly ecological. One of our key arguments is that migration is an ecological issue, and borders are an ecological issue. And then on a much more simple note, I read the Bacurau film by Kleber Mendonça, Brazilian film, which came out last year, is. I started watching it. It was on Mubi recently, and I watched it, and I paused it about halfway through because I was sort of thought this is the closest I've ever seen to something that I would call disaster communism. And I just thought, I wondered if anyone else had made the connection. And Mubi were promoting it as disaster communism. I don't know how I feel about this, but it's a stunning film, absolutely stunning, about a small rural community in Brazil in the near future. There are all kinds of kind of quirky characters, a guy who kind of walks around playing the guitar. It's everything that environmentalism so often isn't. It's, you know, there are queer relations, there are people who are non-binary. It seems to have a kind of communist system of distribution and of wealth, and it's under threat from these cosplaying white kind of militia who go on holiday so they can shoot people, and they, through their solidarity, they try and resist. It's an incredible film, and I can't recommend it highly. It's very violent, but it's a vengeful, cleansing violence in many ways. I really recommend Bacurau.
Yeah, so I'm not going to recommend anything, but just kind of wrap things up here, maybe. I do want to say that thanks, Alyssa, for opening the question of the state with like 15 minutes left. So it didn't dominate like the entire, because we could have just talked about the state the entire time. I think we should do that at some point, because I think it's morphed in so many ways beyond the ways in which people have discussed the state over the past several hundred years. So it's interesting to think about and through, and important, of course. But I do want to just say thanks everyone for sticking with us, and thanks to Red May for having us. I think that we wanted to give an extra special thanks to Andy Battle and Malav Kanuga at Common Notions for helping us in doing some of the organizing. I'm told that the Hope Against Hope is officially in bookstores everywhere, which you should not go to, but surreptitiously have delivered from on June 16th of 2020. But you can also pre-order the book now at the Common Notions website, and they're shipping and obviously physically available as well. You can follow us on Twitter at @out_woods. And if you want to email us, our email is outofthewoodscollective@gmail.com. And we really like doing these kinds of events. We have a few more of them kind of with smaller groups and others, given that we can't, kind of, and won't be physically convening people in spaces to talk about it. We're happy to kind of coordinate with others and different members of the group as well. And we're also in the process of expanding the group and adding more folks. So if this is your jam, definitely send us an email or add us on Twitter. So it sounds like if this is the last word, I'm going to kick it back to Phil for some final thoughts.
Yeah, I would also like to echo Kai in thanking Malav Kanuga and Andy Battle at Common Notions for helping to bring this event together. And thanks all of you in the collective for focusing on ecological Malthusianism, which has been around since the Whole Earth catalog in my day, when Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb and Garrett Hardin were somehow included in the catalog along with Milton Friedman. And Sophie, I'm glad we got a little Donna Haraway in anyway. We didn't get a whole event, but we're all cyborgs here, not goddesses. So no romantic nature that we're going to commune with, no young Marx alienation misinterpreted. I think you laid it out beautifully. And Alyssa, thank you very much for coming in to moderate this. It was very interesting to see the comradely way in which you dialogue your differences. I think we mirrored and also the last notion of, I think David said he was not an expert at some point when it was talking about agro-food. And of course, expertise is a liberal notion. For liberal technocrats, for us, it's fish in the morning, write a poem in the afternoon, and everybody go up and help someone build a house later. So with that, I would like to say again, thank you, and to alert people that Jody Dean, who was mentioned in this event, will be in another Red May event in 2 hours and 45 minutes. System Crash, What Next? She'll be talking with Asad Haider, Leo Panich, and Doug Henwood. So do come back for that. It should be really good. And also, please give us something to keep this mad enterprise whirling along. You can find us at www.redmayseattle.org. On our website, we depend, like Blanche Dubois, on the kindness of strangers. So look into your pockets or into your hearts and click, give us something. Or you can also find it at the our YouTube Red May TV channel, where there's a link to donate. And also please subscribe, because then you'll hear about all the 15 events that are left. So once again, enjoy the rest of the day and stay away from white males with AR-16s.